The first topic in this lesson is access control. Now, Azure SQL Database limits access to the database through firewall rules, which are authentication techniques that require users to log into the database with a valid username and password. Azure SQL Database further controls access to the underlying data through role-based permissions and row-level security. So let's start by looking at firewall rules. Azure SQL Database uses firewall rules to limit access to authorized IP addresses and block access to IP addresses that are not authorized. It's the first level of access control provided by Azure. The firewall rules can be created at the server level and the database level. When a SQL database is provisioned, it's inaccessible to everyone. To make it accessible, we first need to add a server level firewall rule. So a firewall rule allows an IP address or a range of IP addresses to connect to an Azure SQL database. You can then create database firewall rules to enable certain clients to access individual secure databases. Connection requests to an Azure SQL database are first validated against the firewall rules, and the computers with IP addresses specified in those firewall rules are allowed to connect to the database. So in the diagram we have here, we can see a process flow of authentication. People come in from the internet in Azure. There's a server level firewall rule. Are they an authorized connection? Are they an authorized connection? Yes, they're allowed through. They come through to the database level firewall rule. Are they an authorized connection? Yes, they get access to a specific database. And if not, they get thrown out. So people coming from the internet, database level firewall rules are checked. If they pass the database level, then they're allowed to connect to a specific database. If not, server level firewall rules are checked. And if they've got access or they've got a valid firewall rule for their IP addresses, they're allowed to connect to the server. Otherwise, they're in an unauthorized connection. So if a computer attempts to connect to an Azure database over the internet, then the computer's IP address is validated against the database level firewall rules. If the IP address is in the IP range as specified in the database firewall rules, a connection is made. If the computer's IP address doesn't fall in the database level firewall rules, then the server level firewall rules are checked. If the computer's IP address is in the server level firewall rules, a connection is made. If the computer's IP address doesn't fall in the database or server level firewall rule, the connection is terminated with an unauthorized error. And it's just worth noting here that server level firewall rules, you need to be a subscription owner or a subscription contributor to create the server level firewall rules. To allow applications from Azure to connect to an Azure SQL database, you need to add the IP 0.0.0.0 as the start and end IP addresses to the server level firewall rules. So server level firewall rules, they allow clients to access all SQL database in a given local Azure SQL server. Rules are stored in the master database, and they can be configured using the portal, PowerShell, or Transact SQL. Database level firewall rules allow clients to access particular SQL databases within the logical Azure SQL server. These rules are stored within those individual Azure SQL databases, and they can only be configured with T-SQL after configuring the first server level firewall rule. In this demo, we will manage server level firewall rules using the Azure portal. So the scenario we've got to consider database security. As a DBA, it's a significant part of our job. And as part of that, if we've got an Azure SQL database, we will need to manage server level firewall rules from the Azure portal. So we will look at creating, deleting and updating server level firewall rules using the Azure portal. Now in order to do this, we're going to log in to the Azure portal using our credentials. We're going to find and open our Azure SQL server we wish to manage. In this case, it's going to be my Toy Store SQL database here. And then from the Azure SQL Server overview page, I'm going to choose Settings and select Virtual Networks and Firewall. Okay, so if I scroll down here, we can see under the security tab, there's firewalls and virtual networks. I'm going to click on that option. The firewall and virtual network pane will open, and we can see here that we haven't got any firewall rules currently configured. No, that's a fib. We have a couple of firewalls currently configured that I've been connecting to using my my laptop. So you can see there's a few rules in there already. So if we want to add a client IP address, we can click on Add Client IP, and if I click on this, this will attempt to add my current IP address to that range. Now I've got that in there already from a previous exercise where I was planning to connect to my Azure SQL database. Okay, and that will add a firewall rule with the same start and end IP as the client address you were connecting from. You can change the name of the rule if you want to as well, and you can click Save. Alternatively, you can specify another range of IP addresses. So we can say customer IP, and we can give them a start range of 81.101.203.43, and we'll copy that and make that 49. And we can click on Save. Now I don't want to let these in because these are fictitious IP addresses, so I'm just going to discard my change. But then I could save the change, and that firewall rule would be added. So let me just save it quickly and then delete it after. So I've got my custom IPs there. I'm not going to delete those because I don't want them in there. There we go, and click Save. You can update the firewall rule by clicking anywhere on the firewall rule that you want to update. So I can click here, and I can say I could change this to my client IP address, click on Save, and it updates it for me. If you want to delete the firewall rule, we've seen this already, we can simply click the ellipsis and click on Delete, and then save the changes once it's been deleted. Now, to open an Azure SQL database to Azure Applications, we need to switch Allow to Azure SQL Services on and click Save. So you can see there mine is on already. Click Save, but we can turn it off if we want to. So allow access to Azure Services on, and we can click Save. If we turn it off, we can save it after. And that is how we can configure a firewall rule for our Azure SQL database. We can manage the server level firewall rules using Transact SQL. So we want to ensure that if there is an issue while overseeing firewall rules from the Azure portal, we can manage those server level firewall rules from inside Transact SQL. So we saw how we do it with the portal. We're now going to look at, in this demo, how we can do it with Transact SQL. So in order to do this, I'm going to open Management Studio and connect to my Azure SQL server. So I'm going to hit the connect button here, and I'm going to choose Database Engine, and then I'm going to choose my ToyStore SQL, and I'm going to connect with my password. And that takes me in. Now, if I expand my databases there, we can see I have two, and we have the master databases as well. So I'm going to choose a new query, and in here I'm going to do select star from sys.firewall rules. Okay, I can execute my query, and you can see there we have got the firewall rule I created in the previous demo. Now, if we want to add a new server level firewall rule, we can use the SP-set firewall rule stored procedure in the context of master. So we execute this, we specify a name for the firewall rule and a start and end IP address. So if I fire this up, click on execute, it says one row affected. Now, to check whether the firewall rule has been added, we can return and run our select statement. So we do a select all from sys firewall rules, execute that up, and we can see there the work IP addresses have been added in. It shows you when they've been created and when they've been modified. Now the firewall rule names are unique, and if you want to update a firewall rule, then we can call the SP set firewall rule procedure, specify the name you wish to update, as well as the updated IP addresses. So you can see here we've got an update to our work IP addresses. Click on execute, and just before I execute that, just on the work ones, note the current IP start and end addresses are different to what we're going to set these to. So if we execute the update, the set firewall rule store procedure, one row affected, and we do a select again, we can see that the start and end IP addresses have been modified for that rule, and you can see that the create date is 2 minutes apart from the modified date, so we can see we've changed the rule. And if you want to delete a rule using T-SQL, we can use the SP delete firewall rule and specify the name of the rule. So this is going to delete the work firewall rule I've just created, one row affected, and just to verify that's been deleted, we can see that there are no longer the work firewall rule in the list. So we've looked at server level firewall rules. In this demo, we will look at managing database level firewall rules using Transact SQL. As a DBA, security is a significant part of our job, and we're going to want to manage our database level firewall rules, and we can use Transact SQL for that. So in this demo, we will look at creating, deleting, and updating database level firewall rules using Transact SQL. So I'm already connected to my Azure SQL server in Management Studio. You can see there I've got my TiStore SQL, okay, and there is some system DMVs that we can use for listing out our database level firewall rules. So we've got a select star from sys database firewall rules here. If we execute that, you can see that we currently don't have any defined. Okay, now we can use the store procedure SP set database firewall rule, give it a name and a range of IP addresses. We can execute this store procedure to create one, and we're creating our range there. As you can see, if I execute that, we had a whole bunch of ranges to our database firewall rule, allowing people to access. And you can see there we've got master DB firewall. Now this can be executed at the master level. It can also be executed at a database level. So if you want to update an existing firewall rule, there's an SP set database firewall rule that we can use to update. Okay, so in this case we just change the IP address range again. So instead of being 18.10, it's going to be 18.1, and the end IP address is going to remain the same. So we can use the same store procedure to issue an update, and you can see there that the changes has taken effect. The starting IP address range has changed, and then if we want to delete our firewall rule, we can execute SP delete database firewall rule to delete it. Okay, and we run our select again from the DMV sys database firewall rules, and they've been removed.